Someone out fishing one spring day in the hills of East Tennessee climbed down toward the water near a highway off ramp and found a young woman lying in the weeds. She'd been there about 3 weeks, and she had no wallet or anything else on her to say who she'd been or how she'd ended up nearly 900 miles from home. It would take 33 years, two of her brothers, and a tip about a completely different missing woman before anyone could finally say her name out loud. Elizabeth Lamott went by Liz, and in 1984 she was a teenager at the Youth Development Center in Manchester, the largest city in New Hampshire. This was a youth detention facility for young people who'd landed in the custody of the system for whatever reason. For Liz, the reason she was locked up doesn't appear to be clear in the records, but she was right on the cusp of aging out of the system. In either April or November of 1984, the records aren't clear, Liz left the detention on a furlough. A furlough was a fairly routine thing, a window of supervised freedom granted to a prisoner who'd earned it, and on paper it came with the expectation that she'd return when it ended. The plan was an ordinary one. She'd head to Gill Stadium, the old ballpark that sat in the middle of Manchester for the better part of a century, and then go back to the facility. But she didn't. What's stranger still is what didn't happen next. The facility didn't sound an alarm. When her 18th birthday came around in July 1985, her case was simply discharged on schedule, as though she'd aged out and moved on with her life. She hadn't. By then, she'd potentially been gone for over a year, and she was lying unidentified in a morgue in another state. No one in New Hampshire had connected those two facts because no one in New Hampshire had reported her as missing in the first place. Nearly 900 miles to the south and west, the rest of the story had already been written. On the 14th of April, 1985, someone who'd gone fishing near Greenville, Tennessee, spotted a body partially hidden in the brush off Interstate 81. This was less than 60 feet from the exit ramp at what locals know as Exit 44. She'd been found in a state of undress, and the weeds had grown up over her where she lay. It appeared that whoever brought her there had chosen that lonely stretch of interstate as a dump site. The Greene County Sheriff's Department and the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation came out to a scene that gave them almost nothing to work with. There was nothing on her or near her that might carry a name, just the young woman and the ground she'd been left on. The remains were badly decomposed, which stripped away most of what an investigator would normally lean on. An autopsy put her death at roughly 3 weeks before she was found, somewhere around the middle of March. The medical examiner determined she'd suffered blunt force trauma to the head, and that a blow there had ended her life. Investigators checked the national databases for missing people, but of course, since she was never reported missing, this led nowhere. So she became a Jane Doe, one more unidentified young woman found near a southern highway in the early to mid-1980s. Tennessee, Kentucky, Arkansas, and Mississippi had collected a grim cluster of cases just like hers in those years. These were women left along interstates and rural roadsides, several of them with reddish hair. Over time, those cases picked up a shorthand name among researchers and reporters: the Redhead Murders. Theories there have run in every direction, from a single long-haul trucker working the highway corridors to nothing more than coincidence and bad luck stitched together after the fact. Liz's case drifted into that orbit too, mostly because of where and how she was found. To this day, investigators are careful about how firmly they'll link any of these cases together, and whether she truly belongs in that group is something nobody has been able to prove. In 2006, the TBI sent a DNA sample from the unidentified Greene County victim to the University of North Texas Center for Human Identification. A profile was uploaded into the National DNA Index used to connect cases across state lines. It sat there, technically perfect and practically useless, because there was nothing on the other side to match it to. A genetic profile only works if someone, somewhere, has reported the person it belongs to, but for Liz, no one had. Genetic genealogy, for its part, wouldn't yet enter the scene for more than a decade, but this isn't a case that would be solved by this cutting-edge forensic technique. Her family knew she was gone, but the formal machinery of a missing person case had never been switched on. The years stacked up, and the case file in Tennessee stayed open, despite being cold. The break, when it finally came, arrived sideways and had almost nothing to do with Liz at all. In January of 2017, New Hampshire investigators held a press conference about an entirely separate nightmare, the Allenstown case, better known now as the Bear Brook slayings. They were trying to put a name to a woman who'd been connected to a man who went by Bob Evans, a suspected serial killer who'd used a string of false identities across the country. In the end, it would turn out that Bob Evans was an absolute monster by the name of Terry Rasmussen. For a while, the woman was known only as Elizabeth Evans, and the police wanted to know who she really was, so they turned to the public for help. Someone watching the coverage made a connection, and they remembered a girl who'd slipped away from the Manchester Youth Development Center. They wondered whether that girl and the mysterious Elizabeth Evans might be the same person, so they picked up the phone. The tip went to the New Hampshire State Police Cold Case Unit and on to the Manchester Police Department. With that call, for the first time in more than 30 years, someone in an official capacity started actually looking for Liz Lamott. And I have to say here that this is one of the thinnest threads I've ever seen that's caused a significant breakthrough in a true crime case. A teenager vanished, no report was ever filed, and the thing that finally pulled her file into the light was a stranger's guess about Liz. Investigators spoke with people from the youth center and with Liz's own family and friends, who confirmed she'd been gone since 1984. They entered her into the National Crime Database at last, and 2 of her brothers gave genetic samples, and those went into the federal system for the missing and unidentified. On the 13th of November 2018, the answer came back. The lab in Texas matched the DNA from Liz's brothers to the remains of the unidentified woman found off Interstate 81 in Greene County in 1985. Her identity was made public the following day, and the tip that cracked it, the one about Elizabeth Evans, turned out to be wrong since nothing suggested she got mixed up with Rasmussen. What the identification didn't do was answer the question that surfaced the moment her body turned up off that ramp in 1985. Knowing her name tells us nothing about how a teenager from a detention facility in New England came to be lying beside a Tennessee off-ramp 5 months later. There's no record of how she got there, or who she was in the presence of in those last months. The middle of the story, the part between Gill Stadium and Exit 44, is simply gone. Filling in that story is much more difficult as well, given not only the passage of time, but the fact it's not even clear if she disappeared in April or November. One theory I keep coming back to is that Liz's disappearance may not have started with some random stranger on the highway. It may have started much closer to the place she was last officially seen. And to be clear, I'm not saying there's proof that someone from the Youth Development Center ended the life of Liz Lamott, because there isn't. But a lot doesn't add up here. When you look at what later came out about that facility, it becomes much harder to treat her disappearance like a simple runaway case. The Youth Development Center has since become the center of one of the largest youth detention scandals in American history. Former inmates have alleged decades of the most disturbing activities by the adults who were supposed to protect them. Some have claimed that the staff used fear, isolation, and retaliation to keep the victims quiet. There have been criminal charges against former employees, civil lawsuits from more than 1,000 former residents, and a state settlement fund created for survivors. So when I hear that Liz left that same institution on a furlough and never came back, I don't just hear teenage girl ran away. If Liz knew something about someone there and they believed she was going to talk to the authorities, a furlough would have been the perfect window to silence her. It gave her a reason to be outside, and it created a neat narrative before anything even happened. She was allowed to leave, she didn't return, and now the explanation writes itself. Troubled girl, almost 18, probably ran off. But then look at what happened next, and it becomes even more suspicious in my view. The facility apparently didn't raise the kind of alarm you would expect when a teenage girl in state custody vanished. The facility itself couldn't even say if she disappeared in April or November of 1984, which again is a massive waving red flag. Her case was later simply discharged when she would have turned 18, even though she had never returned, and that's the part that really bothers me. If someone from YDC, or someone connected to YDC, was involved, that failure to act would have been the most valuable quote-unquote gift imaginable. No missing person report meant no search of any kind, and no name in a database, which meant no trail to pursue when her body was found. And maybe involved here doesn't even have to mean the person who delivered the fatal blow in Tennessee. It could mean someone who helped her leave, or even more disturbingly, that someone handed her off. That's what makes this theory so disturbing. Liz wasn't just a teenager who disappeared from Manchester and ended up dead off exit 44. She was a ward of a system that was supposed to account for her, and later allegations against that system suggest a culture that let the worst people flourish. If that kind of culture existed around Liz in 1984, then maybe the mystery here isn't only how she got to Tennessee and ended up deceased. Maybe the mystery is who realized no one would come looking and who benefited from her being discharged from a system she had already vanished from. Anyway, unfortunately, it remains unclear to me if this case is still being seriously investigated, since I think this one is even darker than we could imagine. Sometime in the dark hours before sunrise on October 8th, 2014, someone entered a small house on a busy road just outside Albany, New York. By the time the morning shift was getting started at a takeout restaurant down the street, 4 people inside that house were gone. Inside were a father, a mother, and their 2 young boys. Whoever did this left behind blood and forensic evidence, but no name and no obvious reason for any of it. More than 10 years later, investigators still can't tell you who walked through that door or why. Jin Chen was 39 and his wife Haiyan Li was 38. Both had come from Hoyu, a town in Fujian, a coastal province in southeastern China. The Chens settled in Guilderland, a quiet suburb on the western edge of Albany, near a takeout place called King's Walk that was run by relatives and where Jin worked. 2 sons followed with Anthony, born in 2004, and Eddie in 2007. The boys grew up as ordinary American kids, walking to the local elementary school just like everyone else on the block. A neighbor later described the kind of normal you'd expect from any young family. The boys playing in the backyard while their mother gardened and kept an eye on them. By every visible measure, they'd built the exact life the move to America was supposed to deliver. A modest, steady suburban existence in a place where violent crime didn't exist. But underneath the surface, something was subtly off about the family, as financial records would later allegedly show. The alarm was raised by an empty spot on a shift schedule. Around midday on October 8th, a co-worker at King's Walk started to worry when Jin didn't turn up for work and didn't call to explain why. He walked the half-mile or so to the Chen's home on Western Avenue, a busy 4-lane stretch of US Route 20, and let himself in. What he found inside the small bungalow was beyond anything he could have braced for. His own English was so limited that he couldn't manage the emergency call himself. He had to track down another coworker, a relative of the family, to dial 911 on his behalf and communicate the tragic scene he had seen. Guilderland police arrived and began sealing off the scene, soon joined by state police detectives who would spend the next several days combing the ground behind and around the house. Jin was found on the first floor while his wife and their 2 sons were upstairs, covered over with a blanket. The victims had been beaten, reportedly with a hammer, and stabbed. Autopsies eventually placed the time of death in a narrow window between roughly 3:30 and 6:30 that morning. The town's police chief, Carol Lawler, had grown up in that very neighborhood, and she admitted she'd never seen anything remotely like it. Within days, makeshift memorials of flowers and candles appeared both at the house and at the boys' school. The sheer scale of the thing pulled in a wave of press, including Chinese-language newspapers widely read among recent immigrants, who sent their own reporters from New York City. If the discovery was shocking, the investigation that followed was maddening. The first 48 hours after a crime are usually the most valuable, and in this case, they slipped away almost entirely. Part of the problem was language, since many of the people detectives most needed to talk to were Fujianese immigrants who spoke a Min dialect. This dialect is only barely intelligible with the Mandarin most interpreters are trained in. To put this in a little more perspective, this isn't the difference between British English and American English. It's the difference between something like French and Spanish, where shared words would be noticed and a general meaning may be able to be grasped. But that's it. Simply finding someone who could communicate with potential witnesses to the degree required for a police investigation thus became a massive problem in itself. The bigger obstacle in the long run wasn't the language barrier, but fear. A deep, pervasive unease ran through the local Chinese immigrant community, and the Albany County District Attorney later described just how hard it was to get anyone to open up at all. The authorities did try to chip away at that silence, and the family put up a reward of $5,000. The district attorney went a step further, promising that, as far as it lay within his power, his office wouldn't move to deport anyone who came forward with what they knew. Neither the money nor the assurance loosened many tongues, despite the severity of the crime, though for reasons I'll discuss, the reason why may be quite simple. The people who could talk may have been threatened by something that to them was far more intimidating than the American government. Technology offered no shortcut either, since none of the homes or businesses near the Chens had security cameras that might have captured a vehicle or a face on the road that night. Investigators grew openly frustrated when Apple initially declined to release the family's iPhone records. Although the company eventually complied, the delay had set the case back at the exact moment momentum mattered most. Forensics did hand them something tangible, including genetic evidence that may well have belonged to the person responsible, but there was nothing to tie it to anyone. The exact nature of how and where this evidence was discovered hasn't been disclosed to the public, presumably to ensure the integrity of the investigation. Despite the best efforts of detectives, the case, which had rocked the region, went cold. A full year on, the case had generated only around 600 leads, a number the head of the state police's Criminal Investigations Bureau considered strangely low for a crime this severe. The reach of the effort, by contrast, was enormous despite the lack of any real progress. The FBI and the NYPD lent interpreters and manpower, and detectives reached out to police as far afield as Chicago, Los Angeles, Montreal, and even law enforcement back in China. The harder investigators looked at the Chen's life, the more the tidy picture of a hard-working restaurant family began to blur. From the start, there were investigators who felt the family's money simply didn't add up, and suggested Jin Chen may have gotten involved with the wrong people. By some accounts, Jin had actually shut down his own restaurant a couple of years before he passed, and his wife was living in the country without legal status. Yet the household kept getting by comfortably, with no obvious source of steady income beyond whatever meager amount Jin pulled in. Jin was also known to host low-stakes card games at the house, and one early theory held that the family had been targeted by someone who came back after a late-night gambling session. Jin's brother disputed that specific version of events, while admitting the card games were real enough. The theory that drew the most serious attention reached well past a simple robbery. Jin had reportedly been moving large sums of unrecorded cash, the kind used to pay undocumented Chinese workers staffing restaurants across New York and far beyond it. The work allegedly involved ferrying laborers out of Manhattan's Chinatown to kitchens in distant towns and cities, mostly in upstate New York. That last detail found unsettling support inside the house itself, according to detectives. Investigators reportedly discovered something like 18 mattresses laid out across the basement floor. According to detectives, that was exactly the sort of setup you'd use to host a rotating crew of workers passing through. Set against that backdrop, Jin looked less like a simple line cook and more like a small but real cog in a much larger machine. If he truly was a node in that pipeline, then he sat close to a great deal of money that never touched any conventional bank. However, there's a potential problem with this theory, and that comes from the neighbors. Despite the fact that this operation would have required moving numerous people, no one ever reported any large volume of unusual comings or goings at the house. There were no complaints of the home being used as a makeshift flophouse prior to the attacks, and no one came forward with any such eyewitness testimony after. Once the organized crime angle was on the table, investigators started asking whether the slayings fit some wider pattern. Back in 2011, in D'Iberville, Mississippi, 3 members of a Chinese-American family who ran a restaurant, a married couple along with the wife's sister, were found stabbed inside their home. Investigators on that case eventually came to believe the 3 had been targeted by professionals dispatched all the way from New York City. There would be other echoes too, and at the very end of 2017, another family of 4 was found slain in the suburbs of Albany. This case immediately invited comparisons to the Chen case, though most of those were eventually set aside as a tragic coincidence. By 2018, the state police commander responsible for the region was once again publicly asking for help, reminding people that any scrap of information could crack the case. When he was pressed on whether organized crime was behind the Chen slayings, he wouldn't commit to it outright, but he didn't dismiss it either. The Chens were laid to rest about a month after they passed, in a funeral held in Manhattan's Chinatown. The delay was deliberate, timed so relatives traveling from China could secure the visas and the flights they needed to be there. The family was buried together at a cemetery in Queens, far from the quiet suburb where their lives had ended. In October 2024, a full 10 years on, Guilderland and state police marked the date once more and repeated the same message they'd been carrying the whole time. They're still investigating, but they still need someone, somewhere, to come forward. To me, the Chen family slayings don't feel like a burglary gone wrong. They feel like a professional job. Part of it is the way the perpetrator, or perpetrators, came and went, leaving behind little in the way of evidence. But really, it's every allegation surrounding Jin Chen. The reports about gambling, restaurant workers, undocumented labor, the movement of funds, and mattresses in the basement make the case feel bigger than one family in one house. Maybe those details don't prove organized crime, but they do suggest Jin may have been closer to a hidden economy than people first realized. And that's why the professional hit theory sticks out. This feels more like someone came to the house with a single purpose in mind. I also have to question whether the DNA evidence found at the scene was actually from one of the perpetrators or not. If the residence was being used for gambling and as some kind of trafficking flophouse, that genetic evidence could have potentially been from almost anyone. That said, we don't actually know where the evidence was found, and it's entirely possible that from the context of the investigation, it would have had to be from one of the attackers. Anyway, unfortunately, given this apparent organized crime connection, I have serious doubts about whether this case will ever see any form of resolution. Hey everyone, it's Jimmy with my usual reminder to hit that subscribe button and tap the notification bell. Also, don't forget to check out the Patreon or the membership if you want to take your support for my work to the next level. In the early hours of a July morning in 1994, a witness in a Medellin parking lot heard something strange in the spaces between the gunshots. The man holding the pistol wasn't cursing or shouting threats. With each pull of the trigger, he called out one word, the same word a television announcer screams when the ball hits the back of the net: goal. He said it 6 times, and by the time he stopped, the most admired defender in Colombian soccer was bleeding beside his own car. A country that had spent a year dreaming of World Cup glory was about to learn that something had gone irreversibly wrong. Andres Escobar was born in Medellin on the 13th of March, 1967, into a middle-class family that had nothing to do with the coke money soaking through the city around them. He was, as that would imply, of no relation whatsoever to the more famous Escobar who ruled that city with an iron fist. His father was a banker who later set up a foundation to keep kids off the streets and on soccer pitches. He was a devout Catholic who, for years, went to morning mass with his mother whenever he got the chance. Andres was also known for his charitable work and being extremely giving of his time, despite being a massive superstar in his country. He carried himself the same way on the field, as a gentleman, and people noticed and loved him for it. By his 20s, he'd become the calm heart of Atlético Nacional's defense, a tall center back who preferred to read the game rather than kick his way out of trouble. In 1989, he helped his team become the first Colombian club to win the Copa Libertadores, South America's biggest club football prize, the equivalent of the Champions League. He'd also worn his country's colors at the 1990 World Cup in Italy, where Colombia reached the second round before going out to Cameroon. By 1994, there was reportedly a contract waiting from AC Milan, one of the grandest clubs on earth. He was engaged to a dentist named Pamela Cascardo, his partner of 5 years, and the two were meant to marry later that year. At 27, Andres Escobar's life looked like it was opening up rather than closing down. Colombia at the 1994 World Cup wasn't a hopeful underdog squad. This was, on paper, the best team the country had ever produced. The qualifying campaign had ended with a result that still sounds made up. In September 1993, in Buenos Aires, Colombia didn't just beat Argentina, they took them apart 5-0 on Argentine soil. Pelé, never shy with a prediction, tipped Colombia as one of his favorites to lift the trophy. For a nation more often discussed in connection with Pablo Escobar than anything good, the team had become a source of pride. But the same forces that made Colombian soccer rich in the early 90s also made it dangerous. Cartel money had flooded into the domestic clubs, turning matches into money laundering operations and betting opportunities for some very unforgiving men. The goalkeeper from the 1990 World Cup missed the 1994 tournament entirely because he'd spent months behind bars over his role as a go-between in a kidnapping ransom. That was the world this golden generation lived in. The soccer was beautiful, but what surrounded it was anything but. The darkness reached the squad before the tournament even turned sour. Coach Francisco Maturana later described the strain his players were under, and he admitted he simply couldn't bring himself to put another man's life at risk. The most chilling example came down to a single team composition decision. Maturana was warned that if he started the midfielder, Gabriel Gomez, that player and the coach would pay for it with their lives. The threat named a specific man and a specific consequence, and reportedly it came by phone and by fax. Gomez was pulled from the side that faced the United States and replaced by Hernan Gaviria, a young midfielder thrown into the most poisonous atmosphere imaginable. The coach was effectively picking his lineup with a revolver to the team's head, and Colombia, weighed down by expectation and a dose of fear, fell apart on the pitch. They lost their opening match to Romania 3-1, a result nobody had seen coming. Suddenly, the Golden Team was staring at elimination before the tournament had really begun, and the second group game, against the host nation, became must-win. On the 22nd of June 1994, at the Rose Bowl in Pasadena, the United States and Colombia met in front of a vast crowd. In the 34th minute, the American midfielder John Harkes drove toward the byline and swung a low ball across the face of Colombia's goal. Escobar, doing exactly what a defender is trained to do, stretched out a leg to cut the cross out before it could reach an attacker. He got too much on it, and the ball skidded off his boot, past his own diving goalkeeper, and into the net. It was the kind of accident that routinely happens in soccer, but this time it put the United States ahead, and the Americans went on to win 2-1. The math was now brutal for Colombia's chances to advance, and Romania would need to lose to the United States in a big way, and Colombia would need to destroy Switzerland. Colombia would manage to beat Switzerland in their final game, but it didn't matter because of the result of the other game in the group. Romania's win over the United States sent the Colombians home at the bottom of their group. One of the great pre-tournament favorites dumped out in the first round. Escobar, the great gentleman of Colombian soccer, beloved by the people, had put the ball into his own net in the game that broke the dream. He had no way of knowing for certain how some very dangerous people back home would take that, and what he did next suggested that he didn't fully appreciate the danger. When the tournament ended, Escobar had options, and in retrospect, he likely ought to have taken them. He could have stayed in the United States for a time and visited relatives in Las Vegas, allowing time to let the dust settle. Friends back in Colombia reportedly wanted him to do exactly that, urging him that the situation at home wasn't safe. Instead, he chose to fly home to Medellin, because that was who he was. He wasn't going to hide from his own people over an honest mistake, and he'd even written a newspaper column urging Colombians to keep their heads up. He told them in his gentle way that life carried on, that errors happen, and that they'd see each other again soon on the national stage. He even went so far as to openly accept responsibility for Colombia crashing out of the World Cup, which, all things considered, clearly wasn't accurate. The entire team was playing under conditions that no athlete can properly perform under, with even the team composition itself being dictated by criminals. Escobar's response only deepened the sense amongst the majority of Colombians that he was a decent and humble person. The criminal pressure the team was facing was widely known in Colombia, and he could have sought to blame the circumstances or his teammates or management, but he didn't. He ended his column, in a statement of bitter retrospective irony, with a line saying, quote, "Life doesn't end here." Under normal circumstances, this response would have been seen as admirable, and for the vast majority of people, it was. Unfortunately for Escobar, he was returning to one of the most dangerous cities in what was then one of the most dangerous countries in the world. On the night of the 1st of July, less than a week after the elimination, Escobar called some friends and went out in an upscale district in the city. I have to note here that it really seems like he believed that his sincere apology was enough to quell the unrest around him. They stopped at a liquor store and then ended up at a nightclub called El Indio, and at some point the group split up. By around 3 in the morning on the 2nd of July, Andres Escobar was alone in the parking lot, sitting in his car, when 3 men walked up to him. An argument started, and according to accounts from that night, the men had been needling him about the own goal, and Escobar, normally so composed, argued back. What happened next took only seconds, and at least 2 of the men drew their weapons. One of them opened fire and shot Escobar 6 times. Witnesses reported the detail that would horrify the world. The shooter shouted the word "goal" after each shot, mocking him. He was echoing the commentary from the broadcast as if every shot were being celebrated in a stadium. The men then climbed into a Toyota pickup truck and drove off, leaving Escobar where he lay. He was rushed to a hospital, but the wounds were too much, and roughly 45 minutes later, Andres Escobar was gone. He was 27 years old, 10 days removed from the touch that had ended Colombia's World Cup, and a few months short of the wedding he'd been planning with his fiancée. One of the greatest soccer players Colombia had ever produced had been cut down in his own city. And the manner of it, that taunting word repeated over a dying man, turned a personal tragedy into something the whole world would remember. By morning, the country understood it had lost far more than a great defender, but also a source of national pride. A suspect was in custody almost immediately. On the night of the shooting, police arrested a man named Humberto Castro Munoz, and the next day he confessed to firing the shots. Castro was no random drunk who'd lost his temper. He worked as a bodyguard and driver tied to 2 sinister brothers. Pedro David and Juan Santiago Galón Henao were well-known figures in Medellin's underworld who'd been in the parking lot that night. By several accounts, Juan Galón had bet heavily on Colombia at the World Cup and lost a fortune when the team crashed out. That connection is the engine behind the version of events most people know. Escobar wasn't simply the victim of a barroom argument gone wrong, but a man cut down because powerful gamblers had lost money and wanted someone to blame. Whether the own goal was the true motive or just the insult thrown during a fatal confrontation has never been fully untangled, but the shooter's taunting made the link impossible to ignore. Castro Munoz was found guilty in June 1995 and handed a 43-year sentence, but it didn't hold. The term was later cut to 26 years, and through reductions for good behavior, he walked free in 2005 after serving around 11 years. The other men who were directly involved in the confrontation were never found guilty of any criminal wrongdoing in the slaying. That fact, along with the fact that the actual shooter effectively served just over a decade for what he did, has raised eyebrows. Many, including Escobar's widow, have suggested that this result indicates that there was some sort of judicial corruption at play. Notably, this is a country where just 10 years before, Pablo Escobar had allegedly paid a guerrilla group to lay siege to the Supreme Court of Colombia. To say this was a country where the rule of law had been absolutely bent to the will of powerful cartel interests would be something of an understatement. The 2 brothers, whom prosecutors alleged were the actual shot callers, never ended up facing trial, and their role in the crime, if any, remains a matter of speculation until this day. Juan Gallón, for his part, was cut down in a restaurant in Mexico on February 4th, 2026. The exact circumstances of the attack are still under investigation, and the attack appears to have been particularly brutal, since he couldn't be identified by appearance alone. Not everyone accepts the gambling story, despite the way this case has been framed over the decades. To break the fourth wall for a moment, I had done research on this to include in a video about solved cases. But ultimately, on reflection, I consider the core of this case to be fundamentally unsolved, even if the gambling angle is the most likely explanation. Years later, Maturana, the coach who'd watched his players live under threat, insisted that Escobar's death had nothing to do with soccer at all. He claimed that his player had simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time in a city where violence was a daily fact of life. While I find this very difficult to believe, it's a reminder that Medellin in 1994 didn't need any specific reason to produce a body. To put this in perspective, NYC was at the height of its violence at the time, and despite that, Medellin's violent crime rate was about 14 times higher than the Big Apple.